Yes. I have been doing this YouTube thing for 6 months now. I have made a video a week for 6 months. Never have I been this consistent in anything ever in my entire life before. Will I keep going like this? Probably not, but either way, I'm not just here to bang on about meaningless numbers, and I do indeed have another series to talk to you about today. So hello, welcome back, and I present to you a review of The Vision of Escaflowne, a 26-episode fantasy romance mecha series from the grand year of 1996. It was produced by the studio Sunrise, written by Shoji Kawamori and a bunch of other people, and directed by Kazuki Akane. This is one of those series that's been sitting there in the back of my mind and on top of my watch list for God knows how long. Escaflowne is just one of those names that seems to be dropped in every conversation, in every post, on any given thread, even remotely relevant to its genre. So, did it live up to the hype I'd built up for it, and did it meet the expectations I unintentionally had for it? Well, let's find out. There's a young lady by the name of Hitomi Kanzaki, and well, much the same as many other main characters in anime, she is a high school student. She's got a crush on her Bishonen track team leader, and in all aspects is leading a delightfully normal existence. That is until a chap called Van falls through a sparkly hole in the sky with a weird looking dragon while she's trying to get Senpai to notice her. This escalates rather quickly, and well, she gets sucked through said sparkly hole and ends up in a magical fantasy land called Gaia. Turns out this Van bloke is the king of a small nation, and the world is locked in a rather intense conflict involving enough beautiful robots to make Alan very, very happy. Hitomi is soon revealed to have some sort of clairvoyant powers, and because of this is thrown into the centre of a series of events where the Zybark Empire wants to use the Destiny Prognostication Engine to blast reality and reshape the world anew. It's a story of mystery, romance, fate, and enough feathers to make Beldandy green with envy. And what did I think after this story was presented to me in the first few episodes? Did it meet my lofty expectations? No, it really didn't, and it comes down to the fact that I just plain don't like that story generally. Unless it's Digimon, I'm just thoroughly bored by the person in the real world gets transported into the fantasy world stories. And I really don't know why, but the problem was, with me disliking this setting in general, it led me to become all too aware of other problems I had with it. The first thing was, you really can tell how iconic a series this is just from how much content there is in the show I've seen repeated and plastered across the last decade of its genre. This was not a flaw of the show itself at all, but having seen all this content since and occasionally done better, it lacked a lot of the impact I'm sure it had when it first came out. The same was true of the character archetypes and the overall tone it was able to establish. It almost felt like I was watching a series completely ruined by time, and I was so disappointed in this show I had been so eager to check out initially. But then something started to change. With each passing episode, I felt myself drawn further and further into it, and it wasn't just that I was getting used to it and disregarding my initial problems. It's just that this show was constantly adding more and more to its world, to its character interactions, to its lore, its history, and the overall expanse and depth of its story. It had a fairly slow start, and throughout there still remained things I wasn't fond of, but there was so much more to get into down the line that I could all but ignore the flaws that remained. Like, I still found a good chunk of the main cast to be fairly bland and generic, and the romance felt almost unnecessary at times. I'll give them props that it never got in the way, but the emphasis on it seemed like it was there because they wanted it to be, and not because it was actually a legitimate plot point. This thing is marketed and presented to have romance as a key theme, and though that may just be for the purposes of pandering the shoujo demographic, it really needed to be more developed than Hitomi going, "Oh, blonde Sephiroth is so sugoi, I think I'm in love with him." But as I said, it never got in the way, and honestly, some of you might feel more attached to it than I did. As though I do adore a good romance in anime, it is a very subjective theme in terms of what you can get out of it. And there were so many brilliant things that ended up coming out of this show once each new layer of the story was added on. The directions it ended up going was seriously interesting, and my initial reactions were completely overthrown by the plot development during its mid to late stages. It started off as quite a simple looking action-based fantasy series, but once they started banging on about the Destiny Prognostication Engine, I was like, yeah, this is awesome. And man, you know what else was awesome? The action scenes and mecha combat in this thing completely and utterly exceeded every possible expectation I could have had from what is almost a 20-year-old show at this point. It didn't have any explosively beautiful animation and HD loveliness like our friend from last week, but it had something else. It had some of the most innovative weapon and mech designs, disregarding what they look like, which I'll get into later because blah blah, they look so good. But yeah, it was all sword fights, and they had these like liquid metal shooty claw things, and the Escaflowne itself, yeah, it turns into a dragon. When that first happened, I completely lost my shit. It was so cool. I wish I could turn into a dragon. Actually, no, that'd be really weird. In the end, I found this thing's story to be pretty great. It was able to establish the perfect balance between its fantasy and sci-fi elements, and certain things that are often done so poorly were executed really well. For example, did anyone watch Devil Survivor 2 the animation last season? That show was gobshite with how it used visions and future sight. It was dreadful. But here, that stuff was presented in such a perfect way that it was able to be used as a genuinely well-rounded plot point, leaving up a vast degree of possibilities for story progression. It was meaningful. There was a lot of silly and Deus Ex Machina-like content in this thing, but they they almost felt legitimate and genuine. Because of this show's huge emphasis on fate, fortunes, and destiny, all these crazy situations always ended up being integrated into the story with class, with no bullshit. And so the love triangle that exists at the nucleus of this series is comprised of Hitomi, Van, and blonde Sephiroth, also known as Alan. Great name, shame it's not spelt great. Hitomi is a very standard and typical shoujo heroine, and though her input and role in the story was nothing if not excellent, as a character in her own right, I don't find her all that impressive. This is going to be a recurring theme with the main characters in this series, as they do all feel very standard and almost identical to so many other characters in their positions. And I know that wouldn't at all have been the case if I'd watched this thing back in '96, but I've seen this exact character before so many times. She's a very feminine, love-struck young girl who has noticeably strong morals and cares deeply for the welfare of those around her. Her position in this series was great, and she did a great job as a heroine, but I think by the time I watch something else, I'm going to have completely forgotten about her. And the same is true of Van Fannel, who isn't in the lead role here, but is just one of your fairly standard hot-headed shonen protagonist-like characters. He's naive, he thinks irrationally, goes through the I'm scared of killing people phase, and is a very normal and uninspiring character. Exactly the same as with Hitomi though, his role was presented perfectly and he worked, but I didn't feel compelled by his actions, and nor did I relate to him in the slightest. Which leaves us with Alan Shezar, who I haven't mentioned properly yet in terms of his position in the story, but he is a knight of Asturia, which is a nation our heroes travel to fairly early in the story. He is a beautiful long-haired Bishonen character, and he acts like a beautiful long-haired Bishonen character. He's calm, admirable, well-revered, and fabulously cool. And well, he never stepped beyond my initial expectations I had of him from simply seeing the design of his character, which is utterly gorgeous, I won't doubt that for a second, but to keep repeating myself, I found him forgettable and uninteresting because he sits on the same shelf as so many other characters that look and act like he does. I was really disappointed with how I reacted to this show's main cast, I must say, and a good chunk of the supporting cast too. It's all down to the age of this series and how many times these characters have appeared in work since, so having seen so much, I found them to be weaker than they honestly deserved, because they were absolutely not bad characters, none of them. I just completely lacked the required connection you need to feel involved in their actions. But the saving grace of this thing's cast was down to a few absolutely superb and standout side characters, and also the way in which everyone interacted with each other. Excluding the love triangle itself, which I deem to be a very flaccid and bland part of the show, the way in which a lot of these characters were connected and worked with or against each other made for great viewing, and the fact remains and will never change that so many of these characters had designs that just made me melt and floop into a pool of giddy excitement. As a whole, the designs were fantastic, but certain characters looked absolutely incredible and will be sitting in the back of my mind for many years to come. There was Teardrop Tattoo Terrier with his bicentennial arm and exceptionally cool blue hair, and Robo Gandalf with his mountain of grey beard and giant mechanical chair that sat by the Destiny Prognostication Engine. There were Neko Ninjas, doggy dudes, and a military uniform with enough red trim to make you go Shaznabool. And as I mentioned earlier, this show's mech designs, they almost had me in tears, they're so good. They've got all these capes and swords and crystals, and they're fueled by these shiny pink Dragon Ball things. They look absolutely amazing. They have such a wonderful stature and regal feeling to them, and it just highlights that this show has everything I love about the old anime aesthetic, because you just don't see this anymore. You do get great character and mecha designs these days, I will not take that away from some of these modern series, but I just miss this older style. Things like this and stuff like 5-star stories have such beauty to them, and I know that's a really word to use when describing mechanical death machines, but like, I really mean it. They just all look so gah. You can quote me on that if you want. They just all look so gah. BakaShift. And for animation quality, it's perfectly fine, it's good for its time, and I can't see it being too old looking for those who are used to modern anime. Not much to say about it, it worked, but the brilliance of this series' visuals, as I just gushed about, it's in its design, so the animation quality doesn't really need to be amazing. And on the audio side of things, it was actually much less than I was expecting from something involving Yoko Kanno. The music had some outstanding pieces, don't get me wrong, even if some of them involved lyrics comprising of not much more than repeating the title several times in an orchestral fashion. But overall, I wasn't very impressed with it. Some of the tracks felt really flat and lifeless in comparison to others. It was a soundtrack of high variance for me, and though when it was good, it was really damn good. It wasn't enough to make up for some of the weaker tracks that came with it. And the voiceover was one like many that I described as being very consistent and very good, but occasionally it was exceptional. I was completely involved in the performances by some of the cast, and many others were just alright, but occasionally some of the more emotional shouty moments left a lot to be desired. And to wrap up, the only other thing I have not yet mentioned are the sound effects and overall recording quality, which was a bit soggy and rigid at times, times, but there was nothing wrong with it really. This show is going to be old enough to buy alcohol next year after all, in England anyway. And so, that brings me to the end of my review of Escaflowne. It's something I've wanted to check out for a very long time, but sadly in several areas it felt like it had been damaged by the works that have imitated it, and it's a shame as the series itself and its creators are in no way at fault for this. But either way, I am happy to have seen it, and thus shall be flying a fateful 73% rating on Escaflowne, and it's certainly going to be worth your time if you're into its genres. This is one of those shows that was once licensed by Bandai in the US and Bees in the UK, but sadly since they kicked the bucket, the only folks currently distributing this thing are Madman in Australia. But I think you'd do good to track down one of the out-of-print releases and buy it, because according to this,
Escaflowne quite makes for a perfect purchase. And a main news network.
How do I words? So, have you seen this show? If so, what did you think of it? And as always, like, subscribe, and feel free to drop me a recommendation of what you want me to review next. And you best be hyped for me talking about some pretty boy idols, because I know I am. See you next week. This thing looks so damn nice in every single aspect of its everything. It all looks absolutely a word that means good, but really good. BakaShift.